Hello there, it's the 5th of August. This is Renew Every Morning, and I'm Paul Anderson-Walsh. Hello again, good to be with you again. Thank you for coming back, and you're back for part 2 of our little postcard on the life of Rebekah, excuse me. And yesterday we looked at her as the bride of preparation. Today I'm going to think about her as the mother who wrestled. Now, this lady's story to me is just magnificent. I mean, you could just talk about her, but I've tried to confine it just to 2 talks, and I'm going to take them from this one. I'm going to take from Genesis 25, and there's a spread that goes from about 19 through to about 34. There's a piece in Genesis 27, and there's also the kind of nod towards Romans 9, 10 to 12. But this story is about how the bride becomes a matriarch. And Rebekah, who was the ready bride, you remember we saw her yesterday when she had the opportunity to delay her journey to meeting her husband, says, no, I'm going right now, and leaves everything, literally walks out on everything and goes with Eliezer. She is now in this position where she's married, she's brought this great joy to her husband, she went through this long period where she was barren, as is the case with all the patriarchs. But now she is in this next season, and this next season is not without struggle. And that's an important thing to say. Like Sarah before her and Rachel after her, she had to face into barrenness. But unlike Sarah and unlike Rebekah, she takes her question straight to God, which is really, really interesting. Sarah's story is one where she protests to Abraham, and they come up with a ridiculous plan that causes her some interesting challenges. Rachel's situation is even more fundamental. She just says, well, you better give me a child or I'm going to die. Whereas here, Sarah comes and she says to the Lord in Genesis 25, verse 22, if it's for me to be this way, why do I live? She went to inquire of the Lord. And God answered her, not with comfort alone, but with revelation. She said, look, two nations, are in your womb, and the older shall serve the younger. Genesis 25:23. And now this is a prophecy that tells us more on the fact that she's going to be carrying twins. She's going to be carrying polarities. So this is not just about family, this is about future, this is about spiritual tension. She's got these 2 boys that are in her womb, Jacob and Esau, and they are mirrors maybe in some respect of Isaac and Ishmael, except they're not twins, of course. Isaac and Ishmael weren't twins, but these 2 boys are. One is all about appetite and impulse, and of course that's Esau. The other one is about strategy and struggle, and that's of course the story of Jacob. Now, one is the firstborn by the flesh, and the other is chosen by the promise, and that's their similarity, of course, between Isaac and Ishmael, although in this case they're of the same mother in the same womb, right? So she doesn't carry 2 children. She's carrying with her a conflict, and she's carrying inside of her covenant, and this is important. So now what happens, of course, and bear in mind, wouldn't normally be the case that the younger one would be served by the older one. That's not how succession works. Now what happens is this, that it comes to the point in time within the family where Isaac, who is the father, wants to pass the blessing on. And you should read that story with real interest, because when Isaac wants to bless Esau, who is his eldest, that blessing is not like you and I might say, oh, bless you. No, there is a physical, there's an actual spiritual transmission of something. And the story you know very well, when Isaac gives the blessing to Jacob when he's tricked into it, which I'll tell you about in a minute, he is traumatized because he knows he cannot take that blessing back. So we need to rethink our whole idea about what it means to bless somebody, because that is a very serious business. So when he's now preparing to bless Esau, and Rebekah overhears it. Now when she overhears it, she remembers the word of the Lord, and the word of the Lord is very specific. The elder will serve the younger. Now, she has got herself a problem, because what is she to do? So, unfortunately, she doesn't wait for God's method here. She just uses her own initiative. Now, it could be, I don't know, it could be that if she hadn't have intervened, if the Lord has already said maybe that the elder's going to serve the younger, the Lord would have done something. But there seems to be this moment where she moves forward. Now, does she move forward in faith or presumption? I'm going to say she moves forward in faith, because she knows very well that her husband's about to make a spiritual error. And also, if you read the story in Genesis, you'll see it says, and Isaac's eyes were failing. Now, I don't think they were just failing physically. I think they had failed spiritually to some extent. So she orchestrates a deception. She gets Jacob to dress in skins and literally presents him to his father, and as though he were Esau, and she lies to her husband. And yet, what's interesting is that Paul, when he writes about it, affirms her instinct as being spiritually correct. Because Paul pulls back in Romans 9 and says, before the twins were born, she was told the older would serve the younger. So so there is an interesting holy disobedience here, which I find quite interesting. So Rebekah becomes the kind of image of faith, tangled with strategy, the one who tries to midwife the promise through human means. And it's quite an interesting story, this. And I met recently, I had this amazingly interesting encounter with a young man who's from why's it gone out of my mind now? How can I not remember what it's called? The Great American West Point. So he was at West Point, and he was studying here in Oxford. And I met him on the train as he was on my train as we were heading back up to. I was going home and he was going back to Oxford, and we got chatting. And I asked him a question, and I said to him, "So what do you do? What happens in a case where, for example, you're in service and your commander-in-chief asks you to do something that is you can't ethically cope with? It's not something you're prepared to do morally." And he said something really interesting that I didn't know. He said, well, the thing to remember is that we don't serve the president, we uphold the Constitution. And I thought that's such an interesting point, that you serve the Constitution, not the president. And the reason I raised that is because here, that conflict was a similar conflict. She's not serving her husband Isaac, she's serving the Constitution, or more importantly, she's serving the covenant. And so she decides to make this decision, which may have very much upset her husband, but it is the covenantally correct thing to do. And I think this is kind of interesting, but she pays a price for it. So you know what happens in the story. There's this verse it's discovered, Isaac loses his mind, and she says to her son, look, why should I lose both of you in one day, she says. And Jacob flees from Esau's rage. Esau is furious, and Jacob's furious, everybody's furious, so off she goes. And she saves the promise, but she loses her son. And that is a very high price to pay. But there's a Christ-like price in that. There's a father price in that, isn't it? He who did not consider equality with God as something to be grasped emptied themselves. So the tragedy here, though, is that she never sees Jacob again. It's such a sad story. Her faithfulness cost her. But she bore the burden of her calling in the form of the grief of separation from her son. Now, her name, we talked about her name last time, if you remember. It means to bind. And it literally, she binds the family line forward. Because of her act, it kept them on the spiritual straight and narrow. She binds herself to a revelation. In doing so, she gets entangled in strategy for sure. But she's faithful, she's flawed, but she is fiercely prophetic. So there are some interesting spiritual themes here. Hearing God directly, not second-hand faith. Being caught between calling and commitment, or calling and control, if you like. And I think that's an interesting idea. Moving in purpose, but not always with patience. And bearing the tension between kind of love and legacy and loss. And what's our legacy for today? Well, I think there's a number of things we can say. I think one is she's the intercessor who heard the word early and carries it still. I think there's something about, and do you remember this is similar to Mary. Mary stored these things up in her heart. Do you remember that? She's the mother who navigates the tension between her children, because of course Esau's her child, her beloved child, just as much as Jacob is, although the father favours Esau, interestingly. The leader whose actions sometimes kind of overreach the instructions, so maybe there's something about that, but also the believer who says yes, but then she struggles to say, how do I hold on to these promises? So there's a lot of interesting kind of conflict there for each of us, I think. But she reminds us that even children that are chosen by grace maybe wrestle to struggle with the call, how to carry the call of God. So perhaps a very simple idea here, which is that our prayer might be something around asking the Lord to help us not trust just in what you say, but maybe there's something for us to think about in how to bring it to pass, because it's not God's will my way, it's God's will God's way. And teach us to surrender the strategy as well as the outcome. Teach us perhaps to embrace your sovereignty, and let us carry your promise with your grace, even when it costs us. Well, I hope you've enjoyed these couple of little episodes on on Rebekah. It's been fun to bring to you, and I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. All right, God bless. Bye-bye.